Welcome, everyone, to the new podcast episode. My name is Ella Tavar, and I'm so excited to introduce my guest today, Dr. Aubrey de Grey. He is a biomedical gerontologist. He is internationally recognized for his work in the science of aging and life extension. He is the co-founder of the LEV Foundation, which we're about to learn more about. And he's an author of the book called Ending Aging, where he outlines the scientific breakthroughs necessary to push the boundaries of human health and longevity. It is my absolute honor to welcome you, Aubrey. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah. And from your perspective, you have a lot of experience working, and we all excited to learn from you. I want to ask you first, maybe, how'd you get into it? If that's something that you'd like to share.
Sure, yeah. So that's a pretty simple story, actually. I got into this field around the age of 30, essentially when I discovered that biologists, by and large, were not working on it. I had always gone through life assuming that everyone understood and agreed that aging was the world's most important problem. And so I worked on other things because I was, a good programmer, and I thought I'll work on artificial intelligence research. But in the end, I found out that actually most biologists viewed aging as not their problem for whatever reason. So I thought that won't do, so I switched fields.
Well, where were you at the age 30?
In Cambridge, in England. I lived there. I went to Cambridge as an undergraduate in the early 1980s, and I stayed there for a total of 28 years before moving to California.
And what about fast forward to now? What's the most important thing that you think that no one talks about?
Well, I mean, I guess nobody really talks about the irrationality that surrounds aging. Aging is something that people are desperate not to think about because they know we can't yet do anything about it, and they don't know how soon we will be able to do anything about it. So they don't want to get their hopes up. And the only way that most people can do that is by tricking themselves into believing that aging is a blessing in disguise, or that it's somehow, woven into the fabric of the universe in a manner that will never be amenable to medical intervention. And the result is they don't talk about it. Or insofar as they talk about it as more like entertainment rather than an actual crusade. So yeah, that's the main thing.
Okay. Well, that's as a clinical dietitian, I'm going to take you on the route on nutrition first,
Okay.
because this is what I specialize in. And from your perspective, from all this work that you've done as a gerontologist, what role do you believe nutrition plays in extending lifespan and health span? And there's any specific dietary approaches that you think can be therapeutical? And personal question, what is your diet consists of?
Mhm. Yeah. So, well, first of all, I do want to emphasize that that is really not my area. I
Mhm.
work on things that can potentially postpone the health problems of late life by a great deal more than anything that we can do today with nutrition or other lifestyle or supplements or anything like that. I'm focused mostly on cell therapies, gene therapies, things that are more high tech, if you like, and that are really not quite ready for prime time.
Yeah.
Today, of course, though, it does make sense to do what one can to maximize one's healthy lifespan, and nutrition plays a big role in that for sure. But in terms of the specifics, all I really feel that I can say is that everybody is different. That you need to, experiment really. You need to figure out what makes you feel good, what is right for your own body, because different things can be right for different people. There's a lot of focus these days, of course, on the gut microbiome, and I'm sure that plays a large part in that. Though actually, I personally predict that the gut microbiome will not be something that we need to directly intervene in once we have really good treatments for rejuvenating the body, the human cells of the body, which is, of course, what I do work on.
I can't agree more. After years of working with people and trying to answer everyone's question, what's the best nutrition? I've actually decided to write a book that's called Utarian Diet.
Yeah.
Exactly what you just outlined, how it's personalized, really depends. And from your perspective, have you tried any different diets like over the years? I'm sure you've tried personally experimenting.
So not really. I mean, the situation when one should personally experiment is if one has some doubt as to whether one is already doing the right thing. And I have every reason to believe that I am doing the right thing for myself, simply because I'm fortunate enough to be tested quite often over the years, starting more than 20 years ago, for various aspects of my biological age. Really high-end assays like measuring 150 different things in my blood and uh, all manner of physiological and cognitive tests and so on. And I always come out way, way younger than I really am. I'm definitely still in my 40s, even though I'm actually 61. So, I figure if it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of thing.
Okay. Well, before we move away from the diet and nutrition, one last question about it. Animal protein, yes or no for longevity and
Uh, I'm sorry, what is this thing?
animal protein,
Animal
because there's
proteins. Okay. Yeah. Well, sure. So, I mean, of course, one's protein intake dictates the composition of one's amino acid intake, right? So there are certain amino acids that are essential because we can't manufacture them inside the human cell, and there are others that are not. And certainly, it's vital to have a respectable um, intake of all of the essential ones. So that means that if one is not eating animal protein, then one has to be a bit more careful to make sure that the plant proteins that one is eating have, a good cover all the bases, so to speak. Of course, bases is a pun because the amino acids are acids, not bases. But the yeah, I mean the advantage of eating animal protein is that you already have that because animals have basically the same essential amino acids. And the downsides really come, I think, from what else you're eating at the same time. From from having less control over one's carbohydrate and fat intake, maybe also one's micronutrient intake.
got it. Yes, thank you so much for addressing this. Well, you mentioned gut health. You mentioned the future of gut microbiome, but let's quickly stop here and talk about inflammation. There's research indicating that gut health impacts everything from inflammation to cognitive decline.
Mhm.
And how do you see the microbiome influencing the aging process? And are there any promising interventions from the longevity perspective?
Well, so the research into the microbiome is, of course, in its relative infancy compared to research into most aspects of aging. At this point, my gut feeling, another pun, is that the main thing we have learned is a rather boring thing, namely that really the main thing you want to aim for in your gut microbiome is diversity. Having a wide range of different bacteria of different types that do different things, and that the main problems come from lack of diversity, which is no surprise because that's the same thing that comes with lack of diversity of dietary intake, as we were talking about a moment ago. Um, in terms of how it has this impact, again, that's really in its infancy. There's a huge number of things that people are finding and not being able to explain well. Certainly, the effect on neurodegeneration is a fashionable one right now that seems to be true, but nobody really knows why, I don't think. Um, as regards inflammation in general, a point that I always feel I have to make is that inflammation per se is not a bad thing. The problem is when it is misdirected. We have this thing called the inflammatory response because we need it. It's part of the immune system. It's part of how we eliminate infections. And dampening it down, which is basically what we do today with anti-inflammatories, is therefore bound to have side effects. It may ameliorate the problems that inflammation causes, but it also attenuates our ability to fight infections. So the right thing to do is not that. The right thing to do is to address the targets of inflammation. That inflammation is, maladaptively targeting, that it shouldn't be targeting, but it doesn't know any better. And that basically means things that kind of look like bacteria, but they can't be destroyed by inflammatory responses. Things like amyloid plaques, things like cholesterol plaques in the artery. Um, for sure, what happens then is bad. What happens is that the inflammatory response tries and fails, so its reaction to that is to try harder. And you end up with this cascade of increasingly serious and systemic inflammation, which has all manner of bad knock-on effects. And certainly, I would imagine that I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that the microbiome plays a role in that.
Got it. So I love how you mentioned the first thing you said, how inflammation is a good thing. Made me think of cholesterol. You know, how cholesterol used to be a very bad thing, but people are missing out on the fact that we do need good cholesterol and we need to balance out our body's ability to metabolize it with the good and bad ones.
Right. Actually, before you go on, let me use that as an example of what I just said that is rather close to home because my foundations over the years have worked on this since actually nearly 20 years ago, and it's gone rather well. There's now a spin-out company that's taking this forward into clinical trials. The issue here is that cholesterol itself, as you say, is a good molecule. In fact, an absolutely vital molecule without which we'd be totally screwed. And it is, of course, carried around the body in these particles, LDL, HDL, and so on. And it gets stuck in places, and particularly the artery walls are places where detritus from these particles accumulates. A type of white blood cell that we have called a macrophage goes into the artery wall and essentially engulfs and recycles this detritus. And in relation to actual cholesterol, that is fine. Nothing ever goes wrong. The problem is that cholesterol is spontaneously subject to certain chemical reactions in the body, in particular oxidation, and oxidized cholesterol of certain forms is indigestible by macrophages, which means that it accumulates inside macrophages and eventually makes them sick, turns them into cells called foam cells, which is the beginning of atherosclerosis. And eventually, when there's too many foam cells, you get this inflammatory cascade that we were just discussing. So the right goal, as I mentioned, is to get rid of the target, which in this case is oxidized cholesterol. And the company that I mentioned, which was spun out from my previous foundation, is doing exactly that. Has found a very good way to extract that oxidized cholesterol from the macrophages that are accumulating it and have it excreted rather than continuing to accumulate and eventually poison those cells.
Okay. And your foundation is based in the US or UK?
All three of the foundations that I have led are based in the US. That's right. The Methuselah Foundation, which was the first one, and then Sense Research Foundation, and now LEV Foundation.
Incredible work.
And they're all public charities. You want to give me money, you will get a tax break.
Yes, let's talk about it. To tell us, how do we get involved?
Well, of course, we have a website, levf.org, L for longevity, E for escape, V for velocity, F for foundation. And we have a nice friendly donate button on the homepage. The work that we do is absolutely vital for this. I mean, obviously, we wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think that. So we're interested in doing early stage research. We don't work in humans, we work in mice. And we're interested in finding the best combinations of treatments that we can give to mice, starting in middle age. That's critical. So as to extend their healthy lifespans as much as we can, and as a side effect of that, to extend their total lifespans. And so these experiments are very large because you need basically 1,000 mice to figure out everything that you can figure out. And they are therefore very expensive, not least because most of the treatments that we're doing are not just drugs that you can provide in the food of the mice. You have to actually do injections and you have to, build viral constructs with gene therapy, things like that. So these are very non-trivial experiments. The one that we're doing right now, which is the first one, began early last year. It's nearly done, and it costs more than $3 million. And that's what they're going to cost, these experiments. It's very, very hard to raise the money for them because the private sector isn't really interested because you're just combining things that already exist and that are owned by other people insofar as they can be patented at all. And the academic sector isn't really interested either because it's not the kind of thing that tests hypotheses and, establishes mechanisms of action and things like that, the things that get high-profile publications. So it really falls to me to do this simply because I lead the only research organization that's doing significant work that's funded philanthropically in this area. And I've been able to achieve that just simply by, building up a large body of, trust and, donor relations over many, many years. But it's still absolute hell on wheels bringing in enough money to do these experiments.
Wow, incredible work that you do. And I'm so grateful that I met you because you're one of the very few people who, how would you describe it? What would you do it out of? Like the greatness of your heart, right? You're not really looking, this is a non-for-profit, you said, right?
Well,
Yeah.
that's right, and I'm always living hand to mouth. I'm certainly not in this for personal financial gain, but you can tell that just by looking at me.
Yeah.
Um, but the thing is, yeah, I mean, I don't really think about my own personal benefit from this, even the personal benefit that I might get from benefiting from the work that I myself am doing. And the reason I don't is because I'm not bringing about something that would never happen otherwise. I'm simply hastening by maybe a few years, if I'm lucky, the arrival of medicines that bring aging under comprehensive medical control. And that means my own personal benefit, or the personal benefit of any one individual, is, a few percent maybe probability that I'll actually benefit, as opposed to either being young enough that I would benefit anyway, even if I did something else with my life, or being too old such that I won't benefit anyway, even however well things go. Um, However, if we think about about humanity in general, if I think about the humanitarian benefit, then 110,000 people die of age-related health problems every day worldwide. So every day that I bring forward the defeat of aging, and I would hope that I do that basically about once a month, um, I'm saving 100,000 lives, and that's very easy to get out of bed for.
Yes, I see that. That's why I wanted to interview you because I saw you in the industry. I mean, I met you at the longevity conference in Switzerland, but I've seen you trending in the industry, and you're very different from everyone we see in the longevity industry. And that's why actually your advice is priceless to me and the listeners. I do have a lot of questions to get to, but I want to hear your advice because you're so non-biased. So even the way you answer it about food, like you're like, I'm not selling anything. Do whatever works for you, experiment and measure. So you mentioned how you test yourself at least once a year, or how many times a year do you do your
These days it's about once a year. That's right. It used to be more like once every 3 years, but I figure since I'm getting older, I should get more information.
Okay. Yeah, because now, precision medicine doctors are advocating for once every quarter, which means 4 times a year, which I think is a little excessive. I advocate for maybe like once or twice a year at the top if you're
Mhm.
really trying to like create the difference. All
Yeah,
right.
and of course that depends somewhat on the extent to which one is experimenting. If you're
Yeah.
trying something new, then it's very important to get the most information you can get, which means making very sure that you have good measurements of yourself at baseline before you start doing the new thing. And then, after maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, having a look and seeing what's changed. Yeah, that makes sense. But of course, since I'm not doing anything new, that doesn't apply so much.
Got it. Let's get into supplements. This is a huge topic and it's trending everywhere, and most consumers are confused. Just how they're confused when it comes to diet. Everywhere we go, longevity sciences, there's a panel of different doctors advocating for vegan diet or carnivore diet. That's why I asked you about animal protein, because most people who are trying to listen to advice, they're confused. They're like, what do I do? They all disagree with each other. So same thing with supplements. There's so many different things, the basics, let's say omega-3s, different antioxidants, and even the newer ones, NMN for longevity. So from your research and from your exposure to incredible amount of scientific evidence, how effective are these in slowing or reversing aging process?
Well, I mean, they are the epitome of what I was saying earlier about everyone being different. I mean, different people just need different things. They have different, weak links in their metabolism. And some of these weak links are to do with genuinely things that are missing from one's diet, micronutrient deficiencies of this or that kind. a lot of these things are for sure due to past metabolic deficiencies, especially in very early life, like prenatally. There seems to be pretty damn good evidence that a large part of why people are living longer now than they were, let's say, 50 years ago, is because of prenatal and perinatal nutrition. I mean, we know that it's not because of fewer early deaths, like infant mortality, because that was already done 50 years ago. That was for the previous 100 years that we were catching. We were increasing average lifespan by stopping people from dying before the age of one or whatever. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear that how well nourished you are before you're born determines your biological age at birth, and that stays with you throughout your life. Which is a bit of a bummer for those who want to compensate for these things late in life, but not necessarily. I mean, first of all, if something works for you, whether it's NMN or NAD precursors, or whether it's rapamycin or omega-3 fatty acids, fine. Certainly, some of these things, from what we know about the mechanisms of action, they ought to help. They ought to, for example, reduce oxidative stress and thereby, reduce the rate at which further damage in your body accumulates as a side effect of your own metabolism. But of course, if one's already in middle age, um, then one's not very many years away from starting to exhibit the health problems of late life, the chronic progressive diseases, and even if one increases that margin by 30% by whatever one's doing, which is a very optimistic scenario, then that's still not very many years. Really, if you're slowing down the accumulation of damage in your body, then the main benefit comes if you start really early in life, like in teenage times or whatever. Um, and that's a large part of why I was driven 25 years or so ago to think more in terms of repairing damage rather than slowing down its creation, which of course has been the dominant theme of my work ever since. Because then you can be perfectly well be 60 or 70 and we can fix you up and buy you a lot more time than we could if we were only slowing down the accumulation of subsequent damage.
Got it. So much of your work focuses on repairing cellular damage, as you said, as a way to extend life. And how do you think the lifestyle interventions, because what we focus on here is the prevention, right? Focusing on educating a younger population group on how they can create more benefits, less damage early on in life, and the lifestyle interventions like diet, exercise, stress reduction fit into a broader longevity strategy.
Well, you're absolutely right to mention stress reduction, but that, of course, is part of the problem. So my first wife, the one who actually got me into this field by accident, by dismissing the importance of aging, she started smoking a pack of non-filter Camels at the age of 14. Um, and she did eventually die of lung cancer, but she got to 79 before doing so. Um, so she was well built to resist that kind of thing. Nevertheless, the point is, of course, she was a biologist, so she knew perfectly well the damage that was she was doing to herself. And a few times during her life, she did try to give up smoking, and it just made her so miserable and so stressed that she thought, that it's not worth the gain. And so, I kind of sympathize with that attitude, not just because everyone's got the right to make their own decisions, but also because, as you say, stress does accelerate aging. And so, doing what makes you comfortable, what makes you happy and content, even if it has downsides, may sometimes be advisable.
Can you describe the biological processes of stress aging us? Is it the heart rate? Is it the cortisol levels?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, it's mainly the stress hormones, right? Yes. I mean, it's not so much the actual stress of your environment, it's how much you feel the stress, how well you cope with the stress. That's what determines levels of stress hormones like cortisol. And yeah, I mean, there's a reasonable amount now. I'm not a hardcore endocrinologist, so I can't tell you all the details, but yeah, it's pretty well known that these hormones accelerate the accumulation of various types of molecular damage in the body generally, not just in the brain. And certainly, if we look at the oldest old in the world, the supercentenarians, people who get to the age of 110, which happens to be the specialist area of my fiance, we can see that they don't have much in common. They have different lifestyles and so on. But one thing they definitely have in common is nothing bothers them. They as I said, they have not necessarily had particularly stress-free lives, but when something happens that might stress you or me out, they just let it roll over them, and it does, and they don't have a spike in cortisol, I guess.
That's a great advice. Is that how you live? I was about to ask you like your personal advice on how to deal with stress, and you just mentioned super centenarians.
Yeah, it's
How
a
did
funny
you
thing. Kind of the same thing. I mean, by some definitions, I have a pretty damn stressful life. I'm constantly traveling. I'm constantly overly busy. My inbox is always a bomb site. But the way I cope with it, I don't feel that I get stressed. I feel that I have a really privileged life, being able to achieve what I had set out to achieve in my life, making a difference to the world's hardest problem. So, I think I'm probably coping with handling my own stress pretty damn well.
Thank you. That's so inspiring. So switching gears here into insulin sensitivity,
Okay.
another big one when it comes to longevity, and it's widely regarded as a key factor in longevity.
Mhm.
So from your perspective, are you seeing any exciting developments in the field that targets metabolic health specifically?
Oh, sure. And yeah, I mean, this comes back to my original finding that I was doing very well for my age. The first few times I was tested for glucose sensitivity, it was perfect. And they tested for the insulin levels, and the insulin level was more or less undetectable, which is pretty much where you want to be, right?
Exactly.
Um, Uh, but yeah, I mean, clearly the big news that about that whole area at the moment is the GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic, which are making a big difference to that kind of thing. They are, of course, mainly designed to modulate appetite and satiety, but it doesn't matter how they do it. The fact is, if people end up being able to have less carbohydrate intake than otherwise, then they're going to end up benefiting their metabolic health. They're going to end up even perhaps reversing metabolic syndrome and diabetes, as well as, of course, losing a lot of weight. I've been using Ozempic and its counterparts as a good example of preventative medicine recently, but also a rather disappointing, a rather dispiriting example. One of the big things that I feel that we are being held back by in this whole crusade is the public's inherent suspicion of preventative medicine. And here I do emphasize the word medicine. I don't just mean prevention in terms of preventative lifestyles and so on. I guess I'm really distinguishing, especially between primary prevention and secondary prevention. So really, the stuff that I do, these rejuvenation treatments, this is secondary prevention because um, we are ideally treating people who are not yet sick, so it is prevention, but at the same time, we are repairing damage that is accumulating and threatens to make them sick in due course. So it's treatment as well. I like to call it the sweet spot between prevention and treatment. Um, and so with all of the things we're doing, in order for them to be embraced by the public, and in particular for the expectation of them to be embraced, and therefore to incentivize people who can write big checks to actually do so and get the work done, right? Um, in order for that to happen, people have to believe that this is worth it. And they just don't trust medicine in general. They think, especially new medicine, it's basically black magic. They kind of know that if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research. That's a quote from Albert Einstein. Um, so, what do we do about that? And Ozempic is kind of good news and kind of bad news. It's good news in that it's the first really big blockbuster class of preventative medicines that's actually made it for decades. But prior to now, really, it was just statins for high cholesterol and ACE inhibitors for high blood pressure, and that was that. And they got there kind of through the back door. They started out being treatments, and they kind of the right people were in the right place at the FDA or whatever, and so they kind of edged their way into being used preventatively. In the case of Ozempic, that's not really true. You've got a much clearer case of things just being driven by public demand, which is fantastic. But unfortunately, it's a very special case because the thing that's driving public demand is not the fact that you are postponing the time at which you might become diabetic. Rather, it's that you're treating something else that you don't like to have, namely being overweight, which is not recognized as a disease, but people still don't like having it. So it's kind of, it doesn't really help us to figure out how to sell preventative medicine in general to the public, which is something we desperately need to figure out.
Yeah, well, the trends of biohackers, I think, help. Those
Right.
are the community of people who just want to become the leaders of their own health and figure it out. I call them the
100%.
super.
100% right. The early adopters make a huge difference. And the thing that that brings me to is enabling the early adopters, giving the early adopters the chance to actually do the early adoption, which is not trivial. If you try to get a hold of unapproved drugs in the USA or indeed Western Europe, it's not trivial at all. But it's getting better. Last year, there was an extraordinarily important piece of legislation passed in Montana, so only at the state level, but much better than nothing, which essentially said that you can get hold of anything you like so long as it's prescribed by a doctor, and so long as the only other criterion is that it must have passed through the safety stage of clinical trials, phase 1. It does not have to go through the really ridiculously expensive phase 2 and 3. And so this opens up huge vistas of possibilities. So this is fantastic. And the other example is offshore situations. Obviously, medical tourism has existed for a long time, but we need to enable it. As I say, we need to have the providers. And so there are now organizations setting up in special economic zones in certain countries. The one that's in the lead right now is something called Prospera, which is in Honduras. Well, actually, on an island off Honduras. And the idea is to actually, yeah, become the global hub of medical tourism and make and give at least the early adopters who have the money to fly to Honduras the opportunity to get hold of these things.
Love it. I'm gonna have to do some digging on Honduras the first time I hear it. All right, going back to inflammation and aging. So there's this new term that's trending called inflammaging, and how the chronic inflammation plays a major role in aging process. And so if you could touch on that, and how do you think anti-inflammatory diets and lifestyle changes complement the cellular repair? That's what
Hmm.
your specialty is, and I have no clue about cellular repair
Yeah,
strategy.
right. So, well, first of all, inflammaging is certainly not a new term. It was coined by an Italian gerontologist named Claudio Franceschi more than 25 years ago. But I mean, chronic inflammation is the point, right? Inflammation targeted properly against infections is not chronic. The infection gets destroyed, and then there may have been a bunch of collateral damage, but that can be repaired by the body at its leisure, so to speak. The problem is the example I gave earlier on, where the target, where the inflammatory response is being mistargeted, maladaptively targeted to things that it cannot destroy, and so it becomes chronic, as you say, it becomes worse and worse and worse. So yes, this can be modulated in various ways. Anti-inflammatories obviously are the current, standard of care for this kind of thing. And the only problem with them is that they're a sledgehammer. They throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, in the sense that they also dampen down one's ability to fight infections. Um, there may be other ways to do this, but I come back to what I said earlier, that the route one, the absolute most sensible way, most common sense way to go about preventing this chronic inflammation is to remove the targets of the chronic inflammation. So the oxidized cholesterol or whatever.
Got it. The next thing when it comes to longevity, what's trending right now and what I want to ask you about is caloric restriction
Mhm.
and intermittent fasting. Specifically, the process of autophagy has been shown to extend lifespan in various organisms. And what's your view on fasting as a tool for human longevity? And how do
Mm.
you think it interacts with cellular damage repair approach?
All right. So, of course, calorie restriction as a concept is even less new than inflammaging. It was discovered nearly 100 years ago that if you take mice or rats and you feed them maybe 30 or 40% less food than they would like, then they'll live 30 or 40% longer than otherwise. And that is a phenomenon that has been studied extraordinarily thoroughly over many, many, many years. And we've pretty much come to the conclusion that there's no one single mechanism that makes it work, that essentially it's an evolved response. It's something that the body does in order to get through periods in the wild in which there really isn't enough food. And the reason it makes sense is because in general, in the wild, you have to worry about reproducing before you're eaten or before you freeze to death or whatever. And so if there is enough food around, then you want to grow as quickly as possible so as to reach sexual maturity and have your offspring before you get eaten, right? Whereas in a famine, there's not much point in doing that because your offspring will die of starvation before they have their own offspring, right? So you might as well instead hunker down, and even if you might or might not, even if the chances of getting through the famine are relatively low, they're better than zero. And so it makes sense to kind of adjust your metabolic priorities in favor of maintaining the body in as good a state as it can be, rather than reproducing. Growth in general is accelerates age. You know, small animals tend to live longer. Small dogs live longer than big dogs, and so on. Um, and And so this all makes evolutionary sense. So then the question is, what does it mean for us? Well, the problem, of course, is that we do have a choice about how much we eat, unlike the mice in cages in laboratories. And so and people tend to like eating. So this is a bit tricky. And there's really two ways that people have come up with to get around this problem and to help people to get the benefits of calorie restriction in a way that they find acceptable. One of them you just mentioned, intermittent fasting, pioneered over the past more like 15, 20 years now, especially by an excellent professor at University of Southern California named Walter Longo. Um, and this basically says, you know, eat what you like, but only for an hour a day or 2 hours a day or something like that. Or maybe for 5 days out of 7 in the week. And the other 2 days just don't eat anything at all. And it turns out a lot of people find this easier than than calorie restriction. What's even more surprising, it turns out if the total amount of calories you're eating on average over the long period of time is not reduced, if it's the same, but you nevertheless do it in this intermittent way, then you get a lot of the same advantages as if you reduce the calories. And
Wow.
this, again, does actually make a good deal of biological sense when we look at what it means for glucose levels in the circulation and also therefore insulin levels and behavior of that. It just preserves the system better. It preserves insulin sensitivity better. Okay, so the other approach to all of this is, of course, drugs, calorie restriction mimetics, as they're often called, drugs that trick the body into thinking it's not getting enough food, even though you're eating just the way you want to. And there are various types of calorie restriction mimetic. Essentially, they interfere with the way in which we use calories, and by doing so, they make the body think that it's not getting the calories in the first place. So in most cases, like metformin, for example, the interference is at the level of the mitochondrion, the respiratory chain, and it essentially makes less um, of the energy that comes from glucose and or from carbohydrates and fats, especially, less of it get to the rest of the body, and that the body senses that and misinterprets it as not getting enough food, so it kicks in these responses. Um, the most famous calorie restriction mimetic, which works in a somewhat different way, is rapamycin. And the way it works is it interferes with protein metabolism, essentially protein synthesis. And by doing so, it makes the body think that it's not got enough amino acids to synthesize proteins with, even though it actually does have them. Um, Now, that is where this business of stimulating autophagy comes from. So the cell has a lot of proteins, floating around inside the cell, and those proteins are recycled as needed, and new proteins are built and so on. But the operative phrase is as needed. And recycling proteins takes energy, and so you kind of there's a trade-off between doing it whenever the protein is no longer needed versus doing it only when you really need it, just being a bit lazy, if you like, about how rapidly you do the recycling. Now, if amino acids are short, or if the cell thinks they're short because of what I just said about protein synthesis, then it kind of scavenges. It says, okay, I need more amino acids. So it goes and does more autophagy in order to break down proteins that it doesn't really need into constituent amino acids for availability to make new proteins. And this has value because it means that proteins, the average protein in the body, in the cell, and especially the average big thing made out of proteins, like the mitochondrion, for example, they are carrying around less damage simply because they've been around for less time, because you're accelerating the recycling relative to how it would be when there was no calorie restriction. And this seems to be good. Definitely having things that are young around is worth having. It takes energy, though. And so again, there's a trade-off. There's only so much that you can do this if you're not getting enough energy in the first place.
Yes, and with that, I want to ask you about emerging therapies and breakthroughs on longevity science. Is there anything you're most excited about for coming up in the future? And do you see any potential for these therapies to work synergetically with dietary interventions?
Well, let me answer the last of those questions first, because yes, absolutely. I'm very sure that in many ways there will be synergy between these emerging treatments and treatments that we already have. Essentially, first of all, at the most simple level, um, the treatments we already have, even if they only give a little bit of postponement of health problems, that's still better than nothing, right? It gives you more chance to be around in time for when these new therapies come along, right? And there's more to it than that. They may, potentiate each other in various ways. Um, but what am I most excited about? Well, of course, because the damage repair approach that I've been focusing on all these years is a divide and conquer strategy, then one answer to that question is that by definition, there cannot be a single thing that I am most excited about. But these days, I kind of would answer a little differently because we're doing these combination experiments, right? And, they seem to be working. We're getting a degree of additivity, of the combinations of these things doing more than any one of them on its own. And that's, of course, what we want to achieve to a greater degree. At the moment, we're definitely not hitting it out of the park. We're not like, doubling lifespan or anything, but we're definitely doing at least as well as anyone else has done with single therapies, in fact, a bit better. And we're learning a huge amount about how to do such experiments and what kind of things to combine. So this is what has led me to predict that we have at least a 50-50 chance of getting to a milestone that I've called robust mouse rejuvenation within 3 to 4 years from now. Now, what is that threshold? It says basically we want to take mice that are already in middle age and we want to double their remaining lifespan. So to put numbers on that, the typical mouse strain that lives, it's healthy, doesn't have anything genetically wrong with it or anything, will live to about 2.5 years. So we take mice that are already 1.5 years old, so they've got 1 year to live, and we want to double that. We want to get them out to an average lifespan of 3.5 years. At the moment, the best that anyone's ever done is about 4 months of additional life if you start late. If you start earlier than that, of course, you can get more, but I want to help people who are already in middle age, right? Um, so yeah, most people have done it about 4 months. We're already at that point. We're getting those 4 months, but we want to do a lot more than that. We want to get out to a year. And I think we've got a pretty damn good chance of getting there with only a few more of these experiments, just as long as we can pull in the money to actually do them. And that, of course, is the rub, because at the moment we don't have that money.
I see. Well, financial investments and donations is one thing. Anything else do you think are the biggest barriers for advancing longevity research? And how do you think the wellness and biohacking and healthcare industries can help overcome these challenges?
Well, I mean, it's an ecosystem, right? It takes a village to do all this.
Yeah.
A lot of the work that I have seed funded and promoted over the years is on the periphery of my own work, especially in the regulatory and advocacy areas. We're very, very interested in the possibility of putting, new legislation in place. I mentioned this thing in Montana already. There's lots more going on in that regard. And, we want really to make that happen as fast as possible because it will incentivize the big players, big pharma and so on, to do a great deal more than they're doing right now, that when they don't really see a clear route to return on investment. I mentioned these places around the world that are emerging and doing new things. All of this revolves around creating a better ecosystem. And certainly the optimal access to and use of treatments that already exist plays a big role in that. So sure.
Okay. Well, before we wrap up, I'm going to ask you this one question. Your work with the LAV Foundation focuses on repairing cellular damage to combat aging. Could you
Well,
explain?
cellular and molecular. So I'm very interested in the extracellular matrix, for example. So let's not forget that.
Yeah, can you explain how this approach differs from traditional methods of addressing age-related diseases and how can listeners benefit from it?
Well, sure. I mean, the fundamental difference from prior approaches is that we are repairing damage. We're doing bona fide rejuvenation rather than slowing aging down. And that's huge. It means that we have the potential to do far more for people who are already in middle age than we could by traditional approaches. The other big difference, or rather, shall I say, the big motivation for the difference, is that we have much greater potential to do divide and conquer properly, if you like, because the problem with pharmacological interventions or supplements or whatever is that they are kind of manipulating this vast network of processes called metabolism that we really badly don't understand, and that therefore we're bound to have side effects. We're absolutely certain to have things, not working together, canceling each other out, and so on. And we're much less likely to have that than we would if we were doing damage repair, because damage repair is much more targeted to particular types of damage.
Got it. Wrapping up with personal advice, you've had quite a journey in your professional exposure and work. And as someone who's been at the forefront of longevity research, do you personally follow any specific dietary regimen, lifestyle habits, fasting protocols to optimize your own health? Because very often my
Mhm.
listeners love hearing the story rather than a lecture. And if you could tell us a little bit of like what you've learned along your personal journey, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, so I hate to disappoint you there because the fact is I don't do anything. I am just one of those repulsively lucky people who I can eat and drink exactly what I like and nothing happens, and I don't even need to do any exercise. And I'm also lucky in the sense that I have been able to get access to very high-end measures of how well I'm doing biologically, and I always come out way, way, way younger than I actually am. So for me, it's a case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just be conservative because I seem to just be built well. But this is by no means advice to your listeners. This is just how I am. The advice to your listeners is very straightforward. Pay attention to your body. Do what works for you.
Well, you did mention the high-end measurements. Maybe you could share those because it sounds like you have a lot of experience measuring things.
Oh,
What are the
sure. Well, so there's now an absolute explosion in this. Loads and loads of clinics that are doing this kind of thing. But there have been a few of them around for quite a long time, and I've been doing these kinds of things for 20 years now, 22 years. Um, what they do is, first of all, they'll take a lot of, about half a dozen vials of blood, and they'll test literally 150 different things for the concentrations. The obvious things like, glucose sensitivity and triglyceride levels and so on, but also lots of things that are not so obvious, lots of micronutrients. Then there's a whole battery of physiological and cognitive tests. You name it, they do it.
what about gut microbiome? Have you
Oh, so
tested?
that's coming now. Yes, of course, that was not done initially, but these days it's becoming a thing. I've had that done once so far, and I have a nicely diverse microbiome apparently. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's other things that are coming along now, of course. The omics revolution, with like epigenetic age and so on, is one big thing that's being done.
Yeah,
It's
I
not-
just tested my age. And I'm actually like right before this podcast, I tried to get access to results. They emailed me yesterday, I got the results. I didn't get into it. So I'm excited to have you done your biological versus chronological age testing? This is my first
Well,
time.
so this is what I'm saying. All of these things are fundamentally that, right? But at the moment, I would say that the epigenetic tests are not really quite ready for prime time. They are getting better, But I still have more faith in the traditional things, grip strength and gait speed and so on. The epigenetic clocks, I mean, what we have so far is a way to, first of all, recapitulate how chronologically old you are. That's useless. We already have birth certificates for that. Um, but then they're getting better at predicting how biologically old you are. In other words, how soon you're going to start exhibiting the chronic conditions of late life. And that's great. What we really need, though, and I'm afraid that we're still a long way from this, is something that's predictive in that way, even in the context of new interventions. In other words, that actually tells you quickly whether an intervention is going to postpone the emergence of, let's say, Alzheimer's from 10 years in the future to 20 years in the future. You know, and at the moment we have to wait those 10 years or 20 years to see, right? We very much like to be able to do a quick test now, and the epigenetic tests, it would be great if we could do that, but they're not really there yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm also very conservative with the testing, but open-minded as well, trying to see what worth it in the out in the industry and learning always. Well, I'm very much appreciative of your time today. We've learned
Okay.
a great deal, and I'd love to host you in Florida whenever you're here. Let me know for longevity dinners that I host here in Miami, West Palm Beach,
Mhm.
and Fisher Island. And yeah, thank you so much for being with me
Well,
today.
it's my pleasure, and I hope you don't get hit too hard by the upcoming hurricane.
Yes, I know that. Well, thank you so much for being with us
It's
today.
my pleasure. Bye for now.
Bye, Aubrey.